let me just talk about the early war. Just a side note on that previous, I'm sorry about this map. The Atlas companies realized that with the advent of the photocopier, it was really hard. People are just going to photocopy their maps. So one of the things they did is they made sure all of their maps use colors that show up as the same color of gray on a photocopy. So it's not good to photocopy your map, but I'm too stupid to realize that. So I just want to point out that Switzerland is not a central power here. It's a neutral country and it's colored neutral. And Sweden and Norway are colored neutral. And Denmark is colored neutral and Spain is colored neutral. But you can't tell that. And Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria are all colored as central powers. So don't let the map confuse you. As you can see up here, there's central powers and neutral. So
was Portugal?
Yeah, they were technically an ally of the Allies, France, Britain.
Yeah.
But they didn't do it.
Kind of a nice little situation. Poor Belgium.
Yes, poor Belgium indeed. They were just standing there.
They're like
total bystander.
Like younger brother who just gets beat up all the time.
Yeah, and they are young. They were only in the country in 1930.
It's kind of funny how similar World War I and World War II are. Like, Germany basically just did the exact same things, except they were a little bit more successful in World War II and then lost anyway.
Well, I mean, essentially the Germans learned a lot of lessons from World War I, and they said, this is how the war is going to go, let's make sure it goes our way, and they made some tweaks to try to make it go their way, but they consciously were trying to fight the same war, just win it. So, I mean, and the power dynamics are such that the geography doesn't change, so it's not surprising that the war has to go the same way in a certain sense. Kylie?
It's also interesting that the beginning of both wars, France was kind of like stuck in its own ways and then had to learn the same lesson but with different technology.
Yeah, France had to learn some hard lessons. All right, so when the war actually starts, and you saw a little bit of this with All Quiet on the Western Front. I don't know if you guys noticed, you're going to ask me, All Quiet on the Western Front, actually, he dies a month before the end of the war. So that war actually covered 4 years. The opening scene is August of 1914, and the ending scene is probably October of 1918.
That is one, I think, thing the movie doesn't capture well, is the actual amount of time that's covering. Because it feels...
Yeah.
Because it's a movie, it feels like a short...
You didn't age up your people at all. 18 and 22 look very different. I mean, I thought that at the end when they had like the younger boys in the classroom and then half of them on the battlefield made it seem like time had passed, because that's kind of where like the guys that start were supposed to be really and look a bit older because they'll do prosthetic makeup and the thing.
Yeah, they did not yet have technologies for aging people in movies.
I just think it's funny that like the age of the people like on the coast of the 4-year war is like the same age that most people are in college.
Yeah.
It's just...
I don't know. I mean, Northland, about over half of the male student body of Northland fought in World War II. I mean, like, the school's cleared out. And that happened everywhere.
What percent of the total student body was that? Because I think at that time it would probably been mostly men.
Yeah, it was still predominantly male, although it was always a co-ed institution, and it always I don't know what the percentages was. All right, so they went into this war expecting a colonial war, or expecting a very short war. The two previous wars in Europe had happened in 1866 and 1870, and both of those wars had been short wars of 6 weeks. The two armies had marched around until they'd both gotten to a position they thought they had the advantage, and then they had fought one battle, and one side won the battle and one side lost the battle, and then they signed a peace treaty. So that's what they expected. And then they had, since 1870, they had a whole series of colonial wars in Africa mostly, but also in Asia. And in those wars, the war had been extremely short and extremely bloody, but not for Europeans. Just to give you an example, the Battle of Omdurman in the 1890s, In Sudan, the British, a force of 2,800 British soldiers, confronted a force of probably 50,000 Sudanese soldiers. The Sudanese soldiers all had rifles. The British, however, had 7 machine guns. And at the end of the battle, the British had 28 dead, and the Sudanese had over 30,000 dead.
Oh.
That was the, I mean, that's the sort of casual, that's what the British thought they were gonna, they thought that's how wars go. We just win in a walkover. That's just how it happens, because it had happened over and over and over again in India or in Sudan or in, wherever. And they didn't realize, I mean, nobody thought through the fact that if everybody has machine guns, this is going to go differently. And I will get into the, the details of the weapons next time. But
Didn't Ethiopia kind of show them that if both sides have machine guns, things could have happened?
Yeah, they
Or did they
defeated
just-
the Italians very badly at Ottawa using machine guns, but Europeans did not take that. And they had the American Civil War. I mean, everybody, in the American Civil War, there were Gatling guns, which are not full machine guns, but they're close. And at Petersburg, they had dug trenches, and it was a siege. And it looked exactly like World War I, but everyone thought that's the dumb Americans who were too stupid to know how to fight a war right. That wouldn't happen to us. We win big at undermining.
And Britain should have learned their lesson. We'd beaten them in a war. Well, they had beaten us since then, but...
War 1812.
They also technically beat us in, well,
They didn't beat us, they were just trust tooth in
Yeah.
the first war.
What, 1812?
Then we did-
The Revolutionary
then
War.
we did technically beat them in the almost war. The pig war we technically won, but there was never actually fighting.
So, because that was what was in people's minds, 6-week war, marching around, one big battle, and they basically thought the battle was going to be won with heroism. That the side that showed the most masculine heroism, charging into battle, charging into bullets, would win. Because they had convinced themselves through all these colonial conquests that the reason they kept defeating people in Sudan or India or whatever was that they were superior, they could stare down danger, they were cool, calm, and collected under fire, and nobody else was, and so their superior masculinity was the reason they kept winning. They were ignoring the machine guns, right? And so that's what they expected. They expected a war of motion, armies marching around and getting in position and trying to flank each other and get better positions, and then they expected one big battle, and then the war would be over. Zach, to answer your question, no, that's not what they got.
It kind of feels like they're like kids who spent a bunch of money on their toys but think that they themselves are the ones that are making their toys so good.
Mm-hmm.
And then they come up against a guy with the same amount of money in the toys, and then they're like, oh shit, well, I'm not that good anymore.
It's not a bad analogy. So the early war, well, first of all, millions of men rushed off to enlist immediately because they were afraid that they would miss the war. Because they thought if the war is going to be 6 weeks and basic training is 4 weeks, I'd better get into basic training now so that I get out of basic training before that one big battle so I can be the guy leading the charge in the big battle and get all the heroism.
Was that kind of like what was getting across in the beginning of All Quiet on the Western Front was like,
Yeah, I mean,
you boys better get off to war right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, you got to go while you still can.
And I mean, they were imagining, coming home and being heroes and riding in the car with a woman on each arm.
You go off to training, you do the battle, war's over, and then you come back home to the girl you've been crushing on, and she wants to be your wife all of a sudden.
Yeah, exactly.
How was it like for veterans returning from war? Like, I know it wasn't anything like that, but like, how much praise did they actually get?
We'll get into that. We're going to spend a lot of time on that. But there was a lot of official sort of recognition of their sacrifice. There was no comprehension of the physical suffering and trauma they had gone through. And there was a deep sense of humiliation on the part of a lot of veterans because they knew that the war had not been a test of masculinity. It had been industrial slaughter, and yet they felt like people were celebrating them as if they were returning heroes who had shown their masculinity. And they're like, no, I was lying on my stomach in a puddle, peeing my pants because during artillery barrage I wasn't manly, but everyone was sort of saying you were manly. And then there's a significant number of men who came back missing limbs and things, or being disfigured, and they really felt emasculated and they weren't real men anymore. And so there was a real disconnect between how the veterans felt about their experience and how the society perceived them.
That kind of gave me another question. How did they deal with injuries like losing an arm or leg or something like that?
We're going to have 2 or 3 readings on that.
Were they just like sent home early, like?
Basically, yes. There was no support system.
There's a word that I'm discharged from the
Yeah.
army, or did they like fill another role? Or
No,
was
they
it
were
basically-
discharged.
Or was it basically just like, don't care if you're
They were just discharged. And there was very little support system for them. And, well, we actually have a number of the readings in this course are exactly about that. Is how do you treat disabled veterans? What happens? One of the things about those enlistments is there was, and the movie captured a little bit of this, there was enormous social pressure on young men to enlist. There were, during World War I in England, there was a movement of young women who would walk around with bouquets of white flowers, and if they saw an able-bodied man of military age on the street, they would hand him a white flower, and it was meant to symbolize, you're a coward, because you're on the street here and you're not fighting. And so they would just walk around handing out flowers to men saying, you're a coward, and you're a coward, and you're a coward, and you're a coward. And
Get your foot off there, Jeez.
there were documented cases of girlfriends saying, I'm breaking up with you unless you join the army. There were cases of parents putting enormous pressure on their sons. You need to go join because it's embarrassing to me if you don't. I mean, there was just enormous pressure on young men to join. And the young men were not reluctant because they thought they were going off to get glory and they were going to go off and prove their manhood and they were going to come back heroes. And yes, they understood they might die, but the percentage of soldiers in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 who had died was pretty small. So there was no sense that we're going off to slaughter. It was a sense of, I might die, but I probably won't, One thing I want to point out is that the rush to enlist was often much more amongst middle-class men than working-class men.
Yeah.
Middle-class men had less, generally, and I'm vastly oversimplifying here, but working-class men generally had less of a sense of nationalism, like I need to, embody my nation and run off and support it, and they had less of a sense of the bourgeois masculinity that required that sort of proving yourself in battle. And just as a little side note, that when war was declared, there were spontaneous rallies in every city in Europe. People just went to the central town square to talk to each other and cheer and sing patriotic songs, and you'd get tens of thousands of people just showing up in the square, and they're singing and cheering and whatever. And we have a picture of this from from Munich, Germany. Huge crowd of people. Some guy took it from the top of the building, and you see, the square is just there's 10,000 people in the picture. And some historian with way too much time on his hands said, we know from letters that Hitler was in that crowd, and he joined up. Let's see if we can find him. And I don't know how long he spent, but he found Adolf Hitler in a photograph, a black and white photograph of 10,000 people. He found Hitler. And if you blow it up, it's like, no, that is obviously Adolf Hitler. There is absolutely no denying it.
That's a little obsessed.
Pardon?
A little obsessed.
Well, historians are over-agreed. Don't trust them.
Says the history teacher.
The historian.
He's a cultural historian, okay? It's the military historians you gotta watch out for.
So there's this initial rush to enlist. And again, France had an army in standing army, and Germany had a standing army. Russia had a small standing army. So essentially, the first big battle of the war is that Germany, this is Germany over here, and they basically invade Belgium. France and Germany share this border here. Here's Switzerland, here's Luxembourg, and this is a direct German-French border, right? And so the French army rushes here because they think that's where Germany is going to invade, because that's the border with Germany, right? And so the Germans, to get around that, invade through Belgium. Okay, they do a big sort of sweeping motion through Belgium, and the Belgians put up a serious fight, but the Germans simply overwhelmed them. And I just to give you some sense, this was a new type of war, and nobody was really ready for the weapons. I can talk about the weapons tomorrow, but I'll just mention that the Germans had a cannon called Big Bertha, which the poor unfortunate 14-year-old daughter of the Krupp armaments factory owner named a cannon after his daughter, and she goes down in history as Big Bertha. She's like 14. Yes, I'm a phallic symbol, but Big Bertha was a cannon that was usually mounted on a train car, and it fired a 2,000-pound shell over 30 miles. And so imagine a 1-ton shell of high explosives. Now the Belgians had a bunch of fortresses that were intended to handle high explosive artillery. They had like 20-foot thick concrete walls. So the Belgians were in these fortresses, 20-foot. The Germans brought in Big Bertha, and what they discovered was that the Big Bertha's shells, 2,000 pounds of high explosives, would not go through a 20-foot thick concrete wall. However, the shock wave of the explosion would kill everybody inside the fortress anyway.
What?
Yes.
That seems like an oddly specific situation to be prepared for. Because that they have one cannon that might come after us. So let's take our wells 20 to 30.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. At any rate, the Belgians put up a hell of a fight, but they simply couldn't stop it. And so the Belgians, they get overlooked, and it's really a bad deal, but they fought the whole 4 years. They basically retreated, their whole army retreated out of Belgium. Well, they were fighting up there in Belgium, but they were helping the French and the British down here. And so they were fighting the whole time, but nobody ever remembers the Belgians. Poor guys, they just remember the waffles. That's it. So Germany, well, actually, let me just give you some. In August, all of the combatants called up 6 million men together, either new enlistments or reservists who were called up to active duty or soldiers on leave, etc. 6 million men got orders to either report for basic training or to mobilize. Just to give you some idea, Germany, when they started the offensive against Belgium, was sending 550 trains per day full of soldiers across the border into Belgium. There was one bridge at Cologne, Germany, that had a train every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day for over a week of carrying soldiers to the front. France alone mobilized 3 million men in 2 weeks. France, as I said, had a standing army. You had to serve 3 years, and then you were a reservist, whether you liked it or not, until age 40. So France could call up its entire male population, had military experience, and could be called up at any moment legally. So France mobilized 3 million men within a couple weeks. The British,
Was that because of like?
because they're next to Germany.
It was just because they were like, we feel like these people are ready for a fight. Let's.
Yeah, they had, in fact, Germany and France had almost gone to war in 1911 over Morocco, and in response to that, France had passed a law upping the mandatory military service from 2 years to 3 years because they're like, we're going to fight these guys, we better be ready.
So the statistic was 2 million for France.
3 million. So essentially, the early part of the war is that Germany pushes through Belgium and they overwhelm the Belgians, and can't reach that high. This is the French-Belgian border. So Germany pushes through Belgium, and the first battles like Cambrai and Mons and Passchendaele are in France, just over the border. But then Germany really begins to push through, and they're heading for Paris. And they get to the Marne River. This is the so-called Battle of the Marne. And the French and the British put together a force and launch a counterattack to stop them. And so the first big offensive is the Battle of the Marne, which is basically to save Paris from the German army. And the Germans had planned to take Paris in 6 weeks and then send that entire army to fight Russia. And so Germany was that close, you know. Let me move the map a little bit here. Germany was that close to Paris, right? There was actually a moment early in 1914 where the French general in charge of the defense of Paris was actually sending soldiers to the front in taxis, Paris taxis. He was just grabbed all the Paris taxis and said, "You're taking the soldiers to the front." It was close enough that Paris taxis could just run back and forth carrying soldiers to the front. And the first battles, Chemin des Dames was one of the first battles. Cambrai, Passchendaele, Ypres, that's pronounced Ypres, it's Y-P-R-E-S. One of the things that I find most amusing is the British soldiers had no idea how to pronounce this town. And so they, you know, it's Ypres in French. But the British were stationed there for the whole war, and they started a newspaper for the soldiers in the unit, and they called it the Wipers Times. So, what you basically have is a whole series of small battles. The armies march around, and I want to point out, World War I is not a mechanized war. I mean, we saw some trucks in the movie, but we also saw a whole lot of horses and trains. World War I was predominantly a war of soldiers marching on foot, horses carrying cargo, and trains moving over longer distances. But it's a war of trains and foot. And so initially you have all this marching around as the army, you know, the French army marches up to the front here and gets ready for the Germans. The Germans attack up here, so the French have to march all the way back up here. And you know, they're moving on trains some of the time, but they got to march the last 20 miles or what have you. And so the early war, the soldiers who experienced it talk about it as just sort of, we're marching forever, and we have no idea where we're going because they keep changing where we're going, and we're marching this way. No, we're going to go back and march that way, and they won't tell us why, but we're just marching and marching and marching. And then they finally started to get battles. And what they got was sort of what they expected. They had one big pitched battle, but then the weird thing happened. They had a big pitched battle, but then they didn't have a peace treaty. They just regrouped and had another big pitched battle, and then they had another big pitched battle, and they had another big pitched battle. And they began to realize that this was not going to be the war they had before. And in fact, what you start to see is the initial push towards the Marne was stopped. It was really brutal fighting in August, September of 1914 as the British and French were throwing everything they had into stopping the Germans. And then they pushed them back, and then you get this sort of line, you see the dotted line. This is where the front wound up in early 1915. But what happens then is each side tries to outflank the other one, and they wind up racing what's called the race to the sea. They each try to outflank the other one, and they wind up fighting on the beaches at the English Channel. And so then the front stabilizes, basically going from Switzerland up to the English Channel. And this is about 440 miles as the crow flies. It's about 600 miles as the front winds around. Okay. Any questions about that? That first spate of fighting was deadly. From August to December, the Germans had 1 million casualties in that fighting. At the Battle of the Frontiers, which is one of those short little battles where they're trying to flank each other, in 2 weeks the French had 300,000 casualties. Just the numbers are just gobsmacking. The British sent over, the British didn't have a standing army. The British never keep a standing army if they don't have to. They have armies in their colonies, but they don't keep an army in England. That's one of their points, is we don't keep an army in England. We have the British Navy for that.
So they're an island.
Yeah. And so the British they put together a very quick expeditionary force, which was 160,000 soldiers. and they just threw them over there, and they took part in the Battle of the Marne, and most of the British were up here in the north, but in the first 5 months, August to December of 1914, the British Expeditionary Force was absolutely decimated. They were just blown away. The 11th Brigade, by December, had 18% of the officers and 28% of the soldiers that it started with in August. Meaning 3/4 of the soldiers were dead or wounded, and 4 out of 5 officers were dead or wounded between August and December. The 7th Division arrived in October with 400 officers and 12,000 men, and 18 days later it had 44 officers and 2,336 men. So it had 10,000 casualties, and 90% of its officers were killed in 18 days. It was absolute slaughter, and the reason it was slaughter is because what we saw in the movie, there were 3 new weapons. Well, one of them wasn't around yet, but there were 2 new weapons at this point, which nobody really had thought about, and I'll talk more about it later, but the machine gun and high explosive artillery shells totally changed warfare. And the reason for this slaughter was that they were using strategies, tactics, and battlefield plans that did not take into account the lethality of machine guns and high explosive artillery shells. And so they were basically it was senseless slaughter. One final point I want to make before we start the movie is the Germans very quickly realized, after the Battle of the Marne, they realized that their whole plan had fallen apart. They were not going to knock the French out of the war in 6 weeks, and the Russians were starting to mobilize, and they were going to have to fight a 2-front war. They were going to have to fight the Russians and the French at the same time. And so Germany basically made the decision that they were going to dig in on the Western Front, this front in northern France. They were just going to dig in, build the best defensive trenches and bunker system they could, and wait. In the east, they were going to try a really aggressive war to destroy the Russians, because they thought the Russians were the weakest of the 3 big allies in the Triple Entente, and so they thought they could push Russia out of the war, just crush Russia, and then turn around and throw everything at Britain and France later. But they basically, the Germans on the Western Front, with a couple of exceptions like Verdun, did not try massive offensives. They would try little tactical offensives. We're going to take that town because it would be a better position. But they basically weren't saying we're going to push on to Paris. And that's one reason that it was so silly in the movie, that the old men were like, we have to push on to Paris. It's like the German army wasn't even trying to do that, right? So they were basically doing a holding action in the west so that they could throw as much as possible against the Russians in the east. Right? France and Britain, on the other hand, were seriously motivated. The French were seriously motivated to push the Germans back out of France. Right? The front is now in France. That's French territory. There are French citizens under German control. There are French villages being blown up. The French are basically going to be really aggressive, and the British are really aggressive with them throughout 1915 and 1916. They're going to keep attacking because they want to push the Germans back out of France. Right? So the early war is the Germans do some tactical offensives. They do have some small objectives they want to get, but they basically are overall taking a sort of a passive position and saying we're just going to dig in, build the best trench system, fortify our situation, and just hold on until we can defeat the Russians and then throw everything we have against the French and the British. And that's actually how the war turned out. That's actually what happens in 1918 is the Russians drop out and the Germans throw everything they have against the French and the British. The one fly in the ointment was those pesky Americans who showed up. Any questions about the early war? One of the ironic things then is that although Erich Maria Remarque noticed how many of his fellow soldiers were getting killed on the Western Front, the Germans had lower casualty rates than the French and the British, because the French and the British were the ones jumping out of the trenches and charging into the machine guns, and the Germans weren't. Now the Germans were still taking casualties from shelling and on the offensives, etc. But the French and British had higher casualties early in the war. The Germans had higher casualties later. Any questions about that?